Norman Wilkinson was born in Cambridge in 1878, but I can tell you nothing about his early life until he attended Southsea School of Art in his later teens. And he followed this with more study at an unnamed art school in Paris. He also took private lessons from the seascape painter Louis Greer, whose work influenced Wilkinson's own to a considerable degree. Like many others who wished to express themselves visually, Wilkinson set out to be an artist and showed himself to be a skillful, expressive painter and etcher with an obvious fascination bordering on obsession for maritime themes. But despite his ambitions as a fine artist in 1900, he created this powerfully graphic poster which bore no stylistic resemblance whatsoever to any of his other work. In the early years of the 20th century, he also started to receive occasional commissions from the Illustrated London News magazine. But other than his ongoing production of paintings and prints, he generally confined himself to the design of more posters, all of which were promoting travel by steamship, and included several for both Cunard and the Canadian Pacific Line. Unlike most of his contemporaries in mainland Europe, who were frequently creating the whole poster, the lettering and typography was invariably added by others, and this lack of overall control was undoubtedly not to their aesthetic benefit. Although with a certain irony it made his images stand out all the more, and their quality was undeniable. In 1914, Britain joined France in the war against Germany and her allies, at which point Wilkinson immediately signed up to serve as an officer in the Navy. But despite the demands of his actual duties on board a ship engaged in naval warfare, he also managed to have images he produced recording the war at sea published in the Illustrated London News and other British magazines of the period. And although his life at sea was undoubtedly perilous, he somehow managed to also find time to record the battles of the Dardanelles Straits and Gallipoli, which took place between 1915 and 1916. This collection of observational watercolour images was later published in book form, and they were considered to be a valuable visual documentary record of the campaign. And he must have spent some time on land because he also created other images related to the war in the air too. Improbable as it may seem, it was also at this time that he came up with a revolutionary concept for creating camouflage for ships, designed to fool the German submarines when launching their torpedoes. It was called dazzle camouflage, and as it was an impossibility to actually conceal the ships from the enemy, Wilkinson's innovative concept was used to create confusion on board the U-boats about what was ship and what wasn't by painting the vessels with vast geometric shapes. This visual disruption actually worked rather well and was used throughout the conflict, and because of its success, Wilkinson was later assigned to Washington, D.C. in early 1918, as the war was nearing its conclusion, where he served as a camouflage consultant to the US Navy. Once the war had ended, later that year he returned to the production of maritime paintings and etchings, but it wasn't until 1922, by which time he was already 44 years old, that he was persuaded to commit more meaningfully to the production of illustration for commercial purposes. It was exclusively in the form of posters, and he produced more for his enduring client, the Canadian Pacific Line. But more significantly, he also began what would be a remarkably long-running professional relationship with the London, Midland and Scottish Railway Company to promote travel on their routes. And unlike his shipping posters, these were created by traditional stone lithography rather than photographically from his originals. And the impact of this alternative technology was clear to see in the flatter, more graphic application of colour and the consequent visual impact the process brought with it. There's no record indicating the level of Wilkinson's involvement in the transcription from his originals, but it was certainly general practice in Britain at the time that it would be print technicians who would be responsible for this technical aspect of their reproduction. And rather than images of the means of travel, they were almost invariably landscapes and seascapes which showed the potential traveller the splendid views and on occasion the historical architecture to be found in the rail company's various destinations. And despite the absence of the painted tonal qualities usually present in much of the art of the period, including Wilkinson's own, their aesthetic appeal and evocative nature could nevertheless be admired every bit as much as any painting in a gallery, and had the added bonus of appearing more contemporary and in sync with the times despite their traditional subject matter. Some of these posters also promoted the London and North Eastern Railway, who also ran trains to the same places, but most of his output continued to be almost exclusively for the LMS. Despite the demands made on his time and creative energy, Wilkinson managed to maintain his career in art and continued to produce maritime paintings and etchings, but it was undoubtedly the commercial side of his output which was now dominant. And although it was manifestly his well-composed depictions of landscapes and seascapes which were his almost exclusive subject, there were other less panoramic series he was commissioned to produce, such as a 1925 collection of interior scenes depicting the homes of great British poets. But whatever their other charms, they couldn't compete with the splendour of his scenic work. Although the obvious function of these posters was to encourage rail travel to what would be considered rural locations, there were also some, including this particularly striking and atmospheric view of the nation's capital, viewed from the embankment of the Thames at evening. And there were yet more which were actually about the more industrial aspects of the company, featuring the trains themselves, and even some which had no direct link to the railway, but were effectively visual tributes to industry and engineering in 20th century Britain. But whatever their mission, all the posters Wilkinson created were what most would consider to be small print runs, at most in the low hundreds, and were created to be displayed in and around the country's railway stations. Additionally, they were also printed somewhat smaller and mounted inside the actual carriages of the train, so passengers could not easily ignore their inducements or aesthetic appeal. In the pursuit of what was by now the dominant aspect of his career, Wilkinson spent considerable amounts of time travelling the length and breadth of the British Isles to study and sketch the locations which would be his subjects. This was conducted at the company's expense, and Wilkinson would also be financially compensated for the time spent travelling as part of his fee. This photograph actually shows him on location, but it's manifestly a put-up job, as it would be an impossibility to capture a train in motion as it passes, unless of course they stopped it in order to sit for the artist. As with most of the art he produced, Wilkinson was conspicuous in his almost total avoidance of any significant human element in the posters he created. Most of his contemporaries in poster design, such as Tom Purvis and Frank Newbold, used figures as part of their compositions on a regular basis, and in many instances they actually dominated their images with great success. But even if Wilkinson's posters lacked this more engagingly human presence, they certainly compensated by creating the rather calming illusion that the scenic panorama laid out before you was yours exclusively to sit and admire. Having had a particularly successful decade in the 1920s, Wilkinson continued to be every bit as popular as the 1930s got underway. And the reputation he had made so far with his posters even led to some more overt advertising work in the form of a collection of prints of his landscape paintings of Scottish rural scenes for Gilbey's Whisky. As the decade progressed, he continued to produce more posters which simply extolled the aesthetic beauty of rural locations around Britain, all of which undoubtedly succeeded in their virtually propagandist mission to encourage travel by LMS rail. But there was also work on other themes, including quite a few more in praise of any number of aspects of British industry, and some of these actually did feature figures within the composition, which, even if not exactly dominant, did serve to humanise the more dramatically brutal mechanical aspects of the images. There was also an extensive series promoting travel by sea to Ireland, which must have been a particular labour of love for Wilkinson, as it gave him the excuse to create seascapes featuring the vessels themselves, rather than the destination. There was also an attractive collection on the theme of England's historic public schools. But whatever their architectural merits, this was hardly what you might consider an inducement to travel. So what their intended purpose, other than a visual reinforcement of British traditional values, was, I can't imagine. In the second half of the 1930s, Wilkinson remained every bit as productive, if not more so, than previously, and in addition to more maritime paintings, the posters for the LMS continued to exploit his uncanny facility for well-composed and engagingly tranquil lithographic landscapes. In 1939, following increasingly aggressive behaviour and a series of land grabs by Hitler's Germany, war broke out again, and Wilkinson was once more assigned to the creation of camouflage, which this time around was primarily used for the concealment of airfields around the country. But he was evidently not a man who could stay on dry land for long, and throughout the years of the war, despite now being in his 50s, he also travelled extensively on board fighting ships to sketch and record the Navy's battles with German ships and submarines. And even as the war still raged in 1944, the National Gallery in London staged an exhibition of around 50 of his war paintings, titled The War at Sea. And the evocative and highly dramatic images he had produced proved to be a significant draw to the British civilian population. The works on show included a series of 9 paintings of the D-Day landings in 1944, which Wilkinson had personally witnessed while at sea. And although his rail posters had inevitably been put on hold because of the war, in addition to his role as a war artist, he nevertheless took it upon himself to create a few posters for domestic propaganda, which promoted the purchase of war savings bonds as a patriotic act to help bring about an Allied victory. After the war had ended, he returned to the creation of yet more posters of precisely the same scenic, generally unpopulated nature as previously. But although a few continued to be created as traditional stone lithography, most were now being reproduced directly from his painted originals by photolithographic means. This bucolic series for the tourist board, to promote the traditional appeal of its various locations, was a perfect example of this less graphic but still visually engrossing approach. And the same was true of the recruitment poster he created for the Navy. The last dated poster I found was this view of a power station for the electricity board from 1951, but there were also some highly uncharacteristic but nevertheless appealing watercolour wildlife images from some point later in the decade. Whether they were created as illustrations for an unknown book or simply produced as prints for hanging, I've been unable to find out, but either way they reveal an aspect of his talent not previously seen. But even if his time as a poster artist was now over, Wilkinson continued to work exclusively as a marine painter. And even in the 1960s, when he was well into his 80s, he travelled to Venice and painted some magnificent scenes of the city's canals and lagoons. And around the same time he went even further afield to both the African Gold Coast, now known as Ghana, and the Bahamas, with paintings that captured the essence and intense light of these exotic locations very successfully. And Norman Wilkinson died at the age of 93 in 1971. During his career, Norman Wilkinson produced well over 100 posters, and although I haven't shown all of them here, there certainly weren't too many that got left out. And when viewed alongside the many oil and watercolour paintings and etchings he also produced, they collectively form an evocative visual record of Britain in the first half of the 20th century, in war and in peace. I can't think of another illustrator or artist from the same period, in Britain at least, who was so determined to avoid human beings as the focus of his work. But all visual creatives have their own personal agenda, and in Wilkinson's case he was manifestly driven by his fascination for the drama and splendour of the sea and the vessels that sailed it, and an equal admiration of the innate beauty of the British Isles and its monuments. And with that in mind, as usual, I'll leave you with another handful of his scenic art and illustrations to bring this video tribute to a close.